The Second Samnite War had mostly devolved into a stalemate. The Samnites and the Romans both knew this. Neither could quite get the best of the other. If the Samnites took a town in Campania or convinced a town in Latium to come over to their side, then the Romans retook that town, or conquered one in Samnium, and vice versa. Those in charge in Rome and in Samnium were beginning to realize that this war had run its course, and that peace was the next step. However, before the two sides could really begin to iron out a peace treaty, a new rumor began to circulate in Italy. A rumor that had a chance to completely upend the war, and maybe even upend Rome's history. What was this rumor? How could it possibly relate to Rome and its war, and what effects did it have on the Second Samnite War? Let's talk about it. So we pick back up in about 312 or 311 BCE. As already stated, the war was beginning to slow down, and it seemed as though peace negotiations could begin at any moment. However, one of Rome's greatest enemies, the Etruscans, began to mobilize, seemingly for war against Rome. This was a cause of great concern for Rome, and a potential godsend for the Samnites. But we are getting a bit ahead of ourselves. What exactly had the Etruscans been up to in the past few centuries? Well, truthfully, they were in a state of slow decline. The Etruscans had been sandwiched between two powers that were easily their equals, or perhaps even greater than combined Etruscan power. The Romans had been an issue for the entirety of Etruria really since the founding of the Republic, and as Rome expanded south, the Etruscans found themselves struggling more and more to push back Rome's growing influence along their border. At the same time, the Etruscans were bordered to the north by the new Italian Celts, who had arrived sometime around 390 BCE. These Celts had been looking for new land to settle, and it just so happened that the Etruscans held some pretty decent land. This meant that the Etruscans and the Celts, outside of a few instances of allying to fight Rome, had quickly become enemies. Add to this the general decline that the Etruscans had experienced since their peak in power in the 5th century BCE, and you get a culture and a people in decline. However, decline does not mean irrelevance. Etruria was still a massive population center in Italy. It is very, and I mean very, difficult for historians and archaeologists to estimate the population of the Roman Republic at the time, as well as the population of the various Etruscan cities, but we know that the Roman Republic was concerned about the Etruscan threat, and we know that Livy and Diodorus both comment on how even in their declined state, the Etruscans still had quite the population. This really makes a lot of sense. Etruria is a very fertile region. While the Po Valley reigns supreme as the most fertile region of Italy, an honor it has held for frankly a very long time, Etruria, modern-day Tuscany, is certainly the most fertile region of central Italy, and has long been a population center. It should be no surprise then that the threat of Etruscan invasion was still a very serious matter for the Romans, especially if they allied with the Samnites. One consul, maybe Marcus Valerius Corvus, but we aren't totally sure, stayed in Samnium to keep the Samnites occupied, while another army, which was supposed to be led by the other consul, Publius Decius Mus, was sent to the border of Etruria to begin preparing for the war. Publius Decius Mus, though, was apparently sick enough that the Senate recommended appointing a dictator, and so Gaius Sulpicius Longus was appointed dictator and given command of the Second Roman Army. We know that Gaius's army was in no way aggressive, and was seemingly content to wait for the Etruscans to make the first move. In the meantime, Gaius simply drilled the new recruits, and by the end of the year it seems as though the army was at least decently trained. In 312, new consuls were elected. They were Gaius Junius Babulcus and Quintus Aemilius Barbula. Both consuls agreed to continue with the division of the Roman forces. Gaius Junius went to Samnium, while Quintus Aemilius went to the Etruscan border. The action for the year started in Samnium, at a town known as Culvia. We have no idea where this town was, but we do know that it was originally a Samnite town that had been conquered or occupied at some point during this war. The Romans had left a garrison in the city, and that garrison came under assault by the full might of a Samnite army. The Samnites were apparently content to starve the garrison out, and after they succeeded in such a move, Livy tells us that they slaughtered the entire Roman garrison, and were, quote, cruelly mangled by the Samnites. We don't know what exactly this means, but it apparently infuriated Gaius Junius, and he quickly marched to the town. Livy tells us that on the same day he arrived, he took the city, and then put every adult male, it's unclear if this was just military men, or if the town's civilian population was included, to death. Talk about revenge. Gaius, though, did not take much time to celebrate. He marched his army to Bivinium, capital of the Pentri tribe of Samnites, and one of, if not the most important city of the Samnites. Here he besieged the town, the second time the Romans had done such a thing. This time though, the Romans succeeded in taking the town and sacked the city. Livy makes a point here to explain that the Romans were much gentler with the population of Bavinium, an eye for an eye and all that. It seemed that Rome was finally managing to get the upper hand on the Samnites. But looks can be deceiving, and the Samnites were not done just yet. The Samnites, seemingly wanting to try and recreate something similar to what happened at the Caudine Forks, put together a scheme. Encamping far enough away from the Romans to not be noticed, the Samnites sent a few soldiers into the Roman camp. These soldiers posed as deserters of the Samnite army and were taken prisoner, and eventually brought before the Roman consul and his commanders to give up information on Samnite troop movement and information about food supplies in the region. I should note here that we have basically no idea where exactly this was happening. We assume it was likely somewhere near Bavinium, but it could have just as easily been anywhere else in Samnium. In any case, the deserters told the Romans of a herd of cattle that had been driven into the nearby forest when the Romans approached. This was a fairly common occurrence during war, and was typically done to try and prevent that easily available source of food from falling into the enemy hands. The consuls were persuaded to send a detachment of troops into the forest to try and secure the herd. We don't know how large this detachment was, but Livy specifically notes that the consuls sent, quote, legions into the forest. So we can assume it was a fairly large portion of the army. This assortment of Roman troops were very lightly armored and carried only the bare essentials for this mission. It really makes a lot of sense when you think about it, as they assumed they were about to go trekking in dense forests. Any extra equipment would only bog them down. However, just as the Romans were about to enter the forest, a chorus of shouts rang out from either side of the path. You see, this was all a ruse. There were no cattle. Instead, the Samnites had set up their own army inside the forest, and had waited for the Romans to show up. The sudden attack was quite effective at first, and chaos reigned. However, the Romans quickly began to recover their wits. They formed into their battle lines, and despite not being fully equipped, were able to stem the bleeding and hold their positions. The consul himself rode to the front lines, and leapt from his horse. He called upon Jupiter, Mars, and any other god who would listen, and declared that he had not marched to war for personal glory. Instead, he had come to war with the goal of glory for Rome, and plunder for his troops. He admitted to being too anxious and too hasty, and that had led his men into his ambush. He turned to his men, and reminded them that they had defeated the Samnites in their cities and on the fields, in Sora and Frigile. In fact, their victories had been so impressive and so absolute that the Samnites were now forced to turn to underhanded tactics to try and defeat them. But what ground was too difficult for Roman courage? What enemy was too strong for Rome? No one and nowhere. The Romans were worked up into a frenzy and fought like men possessed. The Romans pushed forward and secured a position on top of a hill overlooking the bulk of the Samnite army. The Romans on the hill charged into the Samnites and quickly began to overwhelm them. Panicked, the Samnites attempted to retreat back into the forest, but found it now to be an obstacle rather than a hideaway. They couldn't get through the layers of deep undergrowth quick enough, and the Romans slaughtered them as they tried to flee. Livy tells us that very few escaped, and even states that afterwards the Romans searched the forest for the cattle. An interesting choice, Livy seems to say that they actually did find some cattle, which really just adds insult to injury for the Samnites. At the same time these events were happening in Samnium, the Etruscans finally sprung their attack. Livy tells us that the whole of Etruria, minus the city of Arentium, invaded Rome. This is pretty hard to believe, as quite frankly, the Etruscans almost never did anything altogether. But we can assume that a sizable coalition of Etruscan cities allied together to attempt to fight the Roman menace. Arentium, the one named city to not join the war against Rome, was not quite allied with Rome, but wasn't quite an enemy either. It was a complicated relationship, and would actually eventually be a gateway for Rome to further its influence in Etruria, but that's a story for another time. The Etruscans marched to the city of Cirturium, modern-day Sirtri. The city was a key city on the Via Cassia, the road that led from Rome into Etruria. Because of its location on a main road, it was a pretty rich city, and it served, at least at this point, as quite possibly the main city of Rome in Etruria. The Etruscans laid siege to the city, and Quintus Aemilius knew he had to lift that siege or face being boxed out of Etruria. The two sides camped near each other, and the first day was spent by both sides discussing what exactly to do. Eventually, the Etruscans decided to quickly engage the Romans, and on the dawn of the second day, the signal for battle was given. The Etruscans lined up for battle about halfway between the two camps. The Romans lined up shortly thereafterwards, and the two armies set. They actually sat there for half the day. Livy tells us that it was past noon before the first missile was even fired by either of the armies. A pretty impressive feat considering that the Etruscans marched at first light. The Etruscans were the first to charge. The two sides met quickly. The Etruscans apparently held a slight numerical advantage, but the two sides were equally matched, and neither could gain the upper hand. The stalemate collapsed when Rome cycled their lines. Now Rome had put forward a new front line, filled with fresh, or well, I guess as fresh as you can be after sitting in the hot sun all day, Romans. The Etruscans apparently had no such preparations in place, and their front line collapsed under the onslaught of these fresh Roman troops. Luckily though, at least for the Etruscans, all that waiting in the sun did some good, as night fell before the Romans could really pursue the retreating army. Both sides returned to their camps. Apparently though, this battle had done quite the number on both armies, and no fighting was recorded for the rest of the year. The next year, 310 BCE, saw the election of Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus and Gaius Marcius Rutulus as consuls. Quintus Fabius was easily the more experienced of the pair and was thus sent to Etruria, where it seemed that the main fighting was destined to occur. He brought with him more supplies and reinforcements. The Etruscans, though, had done much the same, and their armies were just as well supplied and reinforced. The two forces came face to face on the slopes of the mountains of Etruria, on either side of a wide open plain, both sides readied for battle. The Etruscans again held the upper hand in terms of raw numbers, and were apparently so confident in their numerical superiority that they again chose to charge first. This time though, the Etruscans abandoned their javelins, and eagerly charged forward to engage in hand-to-hand combat. This proved to be a massive mistake. The Romans launched a few waves of javelins at the charging mass of Etruscans before beginning to pick up the stones that littered the ground. Apparently the area was covered in these stones, and the Romans were able to pelt the Etruscans. These stones, while not quite deadly, were great at slowing the charge down, and confusing those unlucky enough to be hit in the head. If you've ever been hit in the head with a rock, I'm sure you understand, it's not a very fun experience. This confusion, along with the fact they were literally being pelted with rocks, caused the Etruscans to slow, and the line began to waver. The Romans took advantage of this opportunity, and conducted their own charge. The Etruscans apparently turned and fled rather than fight. The Roman cavalry chased the retreating Etruscans into the Ciminian Forest, a feared woodland that separated Latium and Etruria. At this point in history, the forest was almost totally impassable, and the Romans were extremely hesitant to chase the Etruscans into it. There are a few different accounts of what comes next. Some say that the consul's brother, Marcus Fabius, spoke Etruscan and led an expedition of Romans to explore the forest and the surrounding area. This expedition then ravaged the local area and eventually provoked the Etruscans into another battle where the Romans decisively won. Following this, the Etruscan cities of Perusia, Cortona, and Arretium made peace with Rome. A quick note here, I'm still confused as to why Arretium is in this list, as Livy specifically mentions that they did not declare war on Rome, but then also says here that they made peace with Rome. It's a little confusing, but make of it what you will. Other accounts simply state that the Romans ravaged the area around the forest enough to draw out the survivors. They fought another battle, Rome won, and the same cities made peace. Either way, Perusia, Cortona, and Arretium, the three leading cities of Etruria, made peace with Rome during this year. Livy doesn't really tell us what this treaty entailed, but he does say it included a 30-year truce. I'm sure that won't get broken or anything. I think this does speak to Rome's growing power. Whatever the real story here is, it can't be denied that Rome had just split their army in two and managed to defeat the Etruscans while holding the Samnites to a stalemate, or even winning. Speaking of the Samnites, at the same time this was all going on in Etruria, the fighting in Samnium still raged on. Gaius Marcius Rutulus captured the town of Aliphae, along with several other smaller towns and villages. It seemed, though, the Samnites were hesitant to engage the Romans in a pitched battle. The news of the Ciminian Forest situation apparently emboldened the Samnites, though. They received information that the Roman army was hemmed in, and that a repeat of the Claudine Forks was on the cards. We don't know if this was simply an intelligence failure, or just false information, or even a purposeful operation by the Romans. But whatever the case is, the Samnites quickly decided they needed to fight and wipe out the Roman troops under Gaius Marcius so as to not allow the Etruscans to steal all the glory of ending such a long war. The two armies met somewhere in Campania or Samnium. We have no details of this battle. We are only told that the final result was inconclusive and that both sides had lost quite a few men. It was unclear, even at the time, which side suffered the most. The consul himself, though, had been wounded, and reports of the situation quickly reached Rome. The Senate panicked, and in their panic determined that a dictator must be appointed. There was really only one choice, Lucius Papyrus Cursor. The issue at hand, though, was that the remaining consul, Quintus Fabius, was on bad terms with Lucius. We don't really know what happened here, but it was a well-known fact in Rome that neither of the two men could stand each other. This was an issue, as it was the consul, or typically the consuls, that had to nominate the dictator. The Senate sent a delegation of leading men and former consuls to Fabius to persuade him. The consul took the Senate resolution in silence and sent the delegation away, leaving the city in limbo as they questioned how the consul would respond. Fabius, though, was a man of his country first and foremost. He understood that Lucius Papyrus was the best man for the job, despite his personal dislike of the man. And so, he went before the Senate and nominated Lucius for the role of dictator. When the Senate thanked him for his cooperation and nomination, Fabius remained silent and simply left without a word. Lucius relieved the injured consul only a few days later. He combined this army with the army that had been serving under Fabius, and he marched towards Samnite territory. In 309 BCE, Lucius received his fight. Once again, we are sadly in the dark for this battle. We know that there was a bit of a competition between Lucius and his master of the horse, as each man led opposite wings of the army, and we know that the Romans won, and because of this victory, Lucius received a triumph. But that's really about it. We have no idea where it occurred, nor how close the battle was. We basically know nothing. We do know that shortly after this battle, a few of the Etruscan cities broke the treaty. Big shock. Quintus Fabius led a Roman army that apparently easily defeated the Etruscan army at Perusia, and the Etruscans were forced to accept Roman garrisons in some of their cities. Fabius also received a triumph, and was even re-elected consul in 308 BCE. After this point, the war essentially becomes a campaign of mopping up the last of the Samnite and allied resistance. Most of the final battles occur in Apula and Samnium, but the battles were one-sided, and Rome dominated. We don't have many details about these battles either. The Samnites had been spent, and by 304, the Romans had finally won the Second Samnite War. We don't really know what the treaty at the end of the war looked like. Livy only tells us that the, quote, old treaty was restored. It's hard to know what exactly this refers to. The treaty before the First Samnite War, the treaty afterwards, we don't really know. We can imagine that the treaty must have been favorable for the Romans. After all, they had outlasted the Samnites, and it was the Samnites that came to Rome looking for peace, not the other way around. We do know, though, that this war essentially ended Samnite influence in Campania, and seemingly even the border regions of Campania and Samnite proper. The Romans are able to fully integrate the Hurancini and the Aqui, two tribes that had previously been in a quasi-independent state as a sort of buffer zone between Roman and Samnite influence. Several Volscian, Sabines, and Latin towns in southern Latium were officially made Roman citizens and cities. This, of course, expanded the true Roman state. Naples, Marci, Marunci, Paleongini, Frientini, and Vestini, all cities and peoples surrounding Samnium, were made official Roman allies. They agreed to support the Roman military at their own expense, and in exchange were given access to Roman spoils of war and protected by the Roman military. The Romans had essentially kicked the Samnites out of Campania, Latium, and Umbria. However, the Etruscans and the Umbrians were not yet pacified, so it's hard to say that Rome had established dominance over central Italy. Instead, the Second Samnite War accelerated Rome's path to dominance. It allowed Rome to fill the vacuum of Samnite influence in the region, and that new influence would give Rome an edge over its other rivals. This isn't to say that Rome wasn't the most powerful state in Italy at this point. It was. But Rome was still vulnerable to an alliance of Italian states. If the Etruscans and the Umbrians, for instance, decided to ally together, then Rome would certainly struggle to overcome something like that. But mano a mano, Rome had by this point become the most powerful Italian state. Think of it something like this. The war had not given Rome free reign in central Italy, but what it had done was allow Rome to start on the path of Italian domination. In the same way that the first series of wars against Etruscan cities were a test for Rome as a local power, this was Rome's first test as a regional Italian power. While they had not 2v1'd Etruria and Samnium from the beginning, they had managed a solid 4 to 5 years of war against both. And it wasn't like Rome seriously struggled with either during this time. They were able to split their armies in two, and kept the enemies separated long enough to pick them off one by one. A feat like that points to a changing power base in the Italian peninsula. This was a turning point in Roman history, even if the Romans themselves did not quite know it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. I have heard your feedback, and it seems like the idea of supercuts is at least slightly popular. Because of that, this Friday I will be uploading the Roman King supercut. Call this a sort of trial run. I would love for you all to leave some feedback on that video when it comes out. And yeah, we'll see how that goes. And if you all like it, then I will definitely be uploading more of those. If you have any comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.